Chapter 6 Sour Business. Sometimes a disagreement between two kids stays that way, just between the kids themselves. But the clash between Greg and Mora had always been right out in the open, and it had deep historical roots. Their wrangling had been noticed by their parents, by their neighbors, by all their friends, and especially by every teacher who had ever had them in the same classroom. Greg and Mora squabble like cats and dogs all day long, always trying to outdo each other. My classroom's not big enough with those two around. That's how their first grade teacher, Mrs. Gibson, had described the situation. Mora and Greg are just both so headstrong. They have a definite personality conflict. That's what their fourth grade teacher, Mrs. Haversock, had said about it. They're like positive and negative numbers, always trying to cancel each other out. That's how Mr. Xenotopoulos tried to explain it. Now that Greg and Maura were both in sixth grade, he was their math teacher. And as Greg himself stood there outside the music room on Thursday afternoon, holding an eensy-beensy book, his long, thin face drawn into a fierce scowl, how did he describe his problem with Maura? I hate her guts! Strong words. It was an expression Greg had picked up from watching old gangster movies. And it was also a stupid expression, because if Moirshaw's guts had come walking down the hall, Greg wouldn't have recognized them. The truth is, all guts are pretty much alike. But Greg was not thinking logically at that moment, and saying that he hated Moira's guts did not feel like too strong a statement. If anything, it wasn't strong enough, because as far as Greg was concerned, Mora was no better than a common thief. She had always been a copycat, which would have been bad enough, but Greg couldn't stand it when she tried to weasel in on his money-making ideas. Mora had been a bother for years, and now this? Greg stuffed Mora's book into his pocket just as the bell rang. He ducked into the music room and sat down. Mrs. Chalmers immediately began playing scales on the piano, and the class began singing warm-up exercises. Greg had his mouth open, and his voice went, "Oh-wee, oh-wee, 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 oh," along with the others, but Greg's mind was elsewhere. He had big plans for Chunky Comics, huge plans, and Mora was trying to sell her stupid eensy-beensy books at school and try to steal his customers. Mora's going to eat into his profits, maybe even mess up everything. Something had to change. Mora, to be exact. She had to change right away, like today. But as Greg sifted through his past experiences with Mora, one particular incident jumped to mind, and it did not give him much reason to hope. Greg's first business outside his own home, was a lemonade stand. He had sold his first cup of lemonade at the end of June during the summer after second grade, and he stuck with it every hot, sunny day all during July and August. The next summer he sold lemonade again, and his customers came back. The second summer, he started using the honor system. People served themselves and just dropped quarters through a slot in the lid of a glass jar. That left Greg free to make money doing something else, like mowing a lawn at the same time. The first really hot day during the summer after fourth grade, he set up shop once more. His new sign announced, "Greg's ice-cold lemonade, still just 25 cents. Less than an hour later, the trouble began, because there was Moira Shaw, right across the street, setting up her own lemonade stand under a bright beach umbrella with a big sign, "Moira's Tasty Lemonade, only 20 cents. All afternoon, Greg had watched helplessly. About half of his customers stopped and bought lemonade from Mora. 2 days later, on a Saturday, it got hot again, and by noon, there was Mora sitting under her umbrella selling bargain lemonade. However, Greg had been thinking. He loaded an ice bucket and 2 jugs of lemonade onto a red wagon. Then he began pulling the wagon around the neighborhood, delivering cold cups of lemonade right into the sweaty hands of the people who were outside mowing and trimming and working in their gardens. Direct delivery was a great idea, and some people bought 2 or 3 refills. Greg was making good money. But 20 minutes later, there was Mora on the other side of the street, pulling a wagon, selling her lemonade exactly the same way. Greg had gotten furious. He looked both ways and then marched across Maple Avenue and planted himself in front of Mora on the sidewalk. She pushed a few strands of damp yellow hair up off her forehead. She looked Greg right in the eye and said, "You're in my way." Greg shook his head. "No, you're in my way. You're the one who's stealing my customers and my ideas." Mora didn't blink. "I can sell lemonade if I want to. Anybody can. Like my mom. She sold lemonade when she was little. She told me so. And I can pull my wagon around anywhere I want to." Then Mora had taken a step closer and put her freckled nose about 3 inches from Greg's, her eyes big and blue and absolutely fearless. "So, get out of the way." Mora probably outweighed him by 15 pounds back then, and Greg hadn't want to have a shoving match, so he'd moved off the sidewalk. But as her wagon went by, he had kicked the back wheel and said, "Why don't you try to come up with an idea of your own?" Mora said, "Maybe I will," and she stuck out her tongue. "Yeah," said Greg, "except you don't even have a brain." "I do too." "So prove it," said Greg. "Maybe I will," Mora said again. And Greg said, "I doubt it, brainless." For about a week after that, Mora didn't show up on the lemonade trail, and Greg had thought, "Ha, I guess I told her." The weather stayed hot, and Greg had been making $2, sometimes $3 or $4 a day. Then one afternoon, he'd spotted Mora going from door to door around the neighborhood. She was wearing a yellow dress and white socks and little black shoes, and she was carrying something in a wooden picnic basket. Greg couldn't tell what Mora was selling, but he could see that money was changing hands. He had watched for about 10 minutes, dying to know what she was up to. Finally, he couldn't stand it. Greg slipped out his side door, ran across the backyard, trotted down the alley, tiptoed between two houses, and hid in the bushes next to the Jansons' front porch. He'd had to wait almost 10 minutes, crouched in the scratchy hemlock branches, swatting at mosquitoes. Then Mora had crossed the street and walked up the Jansons' front steps. Her feet on the wooden porch sounded like a bass drum. Greg heard the bell, then little footsteps came running, and someone bumped into the storm door. Mora said, "Hi, Timmy. Is your mommy home?" Timmy Jansen was about 3. After a long pause, he said, "She's my mommy." Mora said, "Uh-huh. Can you call your mommy for me?" Another pause. Timmy said, "She's my mommy." Mora laughed and said, "I know, so just turn around and shout, 'Mommy, someone's at the door.' You can do that, right? So call her. Go on, call her. Your mommy is at home, isn't she?" Another long pause. "She's my mommy." Mora gave up, and she called through the screen, "Mrs. Jansen? Mrs. Jansen? It's me, Mora Shaw. Is anybody home?" Greg had heard bigger footsteps, and then, "Oh, hello, Mora. Don't you look pretty today? It's not Girl Scout cookie time, is it?" "No, I'm selling pot holders. I made them myself." Over in the bushes, Greg had almost burst out laughing. "Pot holders? That is so dumb!" Mrs. Jansen thought otherwise. "These are beautiful, Mora. So colorful. And you say you made them all by yourself?" "Uh-huh." "Well, I want these 2 for myself, and these blue and pink ones will go perfectly in my sister's kitchen. How much are you charging?" $2 each. "Oh, a bargain. I'm going to buy an extra pair for myself." Greg heard Mrs. Jansen walk away, come back, and open the storm door. And then Greg heard his favorite sound in all the world, the whisper of crisp bills as the money was counted out. Except the bills were being counted into Mora's open hand. "Here's a 5 and 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Would you mind taking 4 quarters?" "No, not at all." Greg heard the coins. Then Mrs. Jansen had said, "And that makes $12. Mora said, "Thank you." "And thank you, Mora. We'll think of you every time we use these pot holders in the kitchen, won't we, Timmy?" And Timmy said, "She's my mommy." Greg had heard enough. He slipped out of the bushes, scooted between the houses, and ran home. It was hot, so he'd gone to the refrigerator and poured himself a glass of his leftover lemonade. It tasted sour. Greg remembered grabbing a pencil and a memo pad so he could do some calculating. If Mora had gone all around the neighborhood, and if every mom who was home had bought a couple of pot holders, then she might have made as much as $50 in one afternoon. $50 was serious money. Then the doorbell had rung, and his mom had called from the basement. "Greg, would you see who's at the door?" It was Mora. She had smiled at Greg and said, "Hello, little boy. Is your mommy at home?" Greg glared at her. Then he grinned and said, "She's my mommy." Mora's blue eyes had gotten wide and then narrowed. She pointed an accusing finger and said, "You were spying on me over at the Jansens, weren't you?" Greg's grin got bigger, and again he'd said, "She's my mommy." Then, whoop! He'd slammed the door in Mora's face. It felt so good. The bell rang again, and as he opened the door for the second time, Greg called over his shoulder, "Mom, there's something at the door. It's for you." Greg's mom had bustled into the front hallway. "Mora, I was hoping you'd be coming. Mrs. Altman called and said you were walking around selling the prettiest pot holders. I hope you have some nice ones left for me." Greg had gone up about 4 steps on the front hall stairs and leaned against the banister so he could look over his mom's shoulder. There was a yellow cloth covering the bottom of the basket, and the pot holders were arranged so they looked like diamonds instead of squares. "These are lovely, Mora. How much do they cost?" Mora hesitated half a second and then said, $3. "3?" Greg said. "I thought they were $2 each." But Mora had held her ground. "I've only got 4 left, and these are my best ones. These are $3 each." Greg had known exactly what Mora was doing. She was raising her prices, trying to discover the most a customer would actually pay. It was a smart thing to do, something Greg would have done himself. And sure enough, his mom had said, "Only $3 for a beautiful handmade pot holder? I'll take all 4 of them." And she'd gone to get her purse. Mora had known she'd just won a battle. She'd look up at Greg, given him a big smile, and said, "Still think I don't have a brain? I just made $12. Another $12 right here at your house. Say, I'm thirsty." She pulled a quarter from the pocket of her dress and held it out to him. "Could you get me a cup of lemonade?" Greg curled up his lip and said, "I wouldn't give you..." But just then his mom came back. He hadn't finished that sentence. He turned around, stomped up the stairs, then down the hall to his bedroom, and slammed the door. Sitting there in the music room, more than a year after the lemonade battles, Greg still remembered clearly what had happened next. He had walked over to his bedroom window and watched Mora walk across Maple Avenue to her front door, swinging her empty picnic basket as she pushed another $12 into her dress pocket. And he remembered thinking that making those pot holders and selling them to moms had been a smart idea, and getting dressed up and putting that nice cloth in the bottom of the basket, also smart. And Greg remembered that he'd had to admit that the girl he had called brainless was actually a good thinker. Moira did have a brain, and not backing down when he had caught her charging $3 per pot holder instead of 2, that had taken some guts. And remembering that Moira had guts reminded Greg how much he hated them. Mora was a tough competitor, and in another 35 minutes he'd see her, because they were both in level 4 math. It was time for a showdown.